My name is Will Cole Hamilton. I'm a counselor in the city of Courtenay, although currently I'm in Kingston, Ontario, on the traditional territory of the Anishinaabe people, visiting family here before going to FCM. And I'm really excited about today's speakers, and I really appreciate Amal and Leanne you making time to be with us today. So today's BC chapter call is going to explore how strategic partnerships and governance structures can accelerate equitable and resilient housing development in municipalities in BC. We're going to hear from two folks, from Amal and Leanne from Renewable Cities, who'll present a new case study highlighting how leveraging underutilized land and cross-sector collaboration has enabled the development of nearly 1,400 new homes in just 12 months. And that's good news. So our speakers will discuss tools and processes BC Builds uses to accelerate the development process and learnings and best practices from BC Builds to apply to other jurisdictions. And just to introduce our two speakers, Leanne Sawatsky is an interim executive director at Renewable Cities at Simon Fraser's Morris Wosk Center for Dialogue. She leads the strategic direction of Renewable Cities with a focus on supporting smart growth for compact, complete, livable, and resilient communities through innovative housing and transportation solutions. And Amal Abdullah is a project coordinator at SFU Renewable Cities, a special initiative of Simon Fraser's Wosk Center for Dialogue. So if it's all right, Amal and Leanne, I'll hand it over to you. Usually we sort of have about 20 minutes to half an hour of a presentation, which is recorded. And then when the presentation's finished, we stop recording and then have a Q&A for the rest of the hour. So if I can hand it over to you, that would be great.
Great, thanks. Yeah, so good to be here. And thanks for inviting us to share a little bit about this case study. Well, as you said, my name is Leanne Sawatsky and here with SFU Renewable Cities. I want to, oh, and sorry, maybe I'll get them all. Yeah, thank you if you want to share your screen. Thanks. So just before we begin our presentation, I just want to acknowledge that I'm a white settler on the traditional enunciated territories of the Musqueam, Squamish, and Tsleil-Waututh peoples who've been stewarding this land since time immemorial. A little bit about Renewable Cities. So we're a special initiative of the Morris J. Wosk Center for Dialogue. And really what our work is about catalyzing and helping catalyze the transition to equitable, livable, and resilient communities. And most often we're doing this through a focus on housing, including some mass timber work and transportation. And so obviously climate for us is a really important and cross-cutting theme of all of our work. So we use dialogue and systems thinking to convene groups, and it's really about building capacity and co-creating practical solutions that are really durable and not and just take into account the different complexities of some of these challenging topics. Dialogue can be a tool for addressing these complex challenges when you have pieces that maybe need more than just technical solutions. So you know more than I do, more intimately than I do in each of your communities about the different unique challenges and considerations about housing. And so one of the questions that we're often asking ourselves are, what opportunities exist or emerge in these situations of flux? And that is certainly a description of our current times. So we're thinking about the opportunities, not just to build housing quickly, but also to ensure that the housing that we're building is excellent, and thinking about how we can get housing right. So that includes being affordable, low carbon, and resilient to climate change. And so thinking about how housing is essential infrastructure that meets a range of needs and more than just a housing unit. In this particular case study, we're talking about how redeveloping community land can be one piece of the housing puzzle. So before Amal shares with you the juicy parts about the BC Builds case study, we just wanted to frame the conversation a little bit in this kind of potential of what we are often thinking about when we're talking about housing, and how we have the opportunity to build housing that is resilient to extreme weather, whether that be the blue-green infrastructure that deals with extra water, or enhancing natural shading from trees to mitigate the urban heat island effect. Buildings that are low carbon, that are fast to construct, such as prefabricated mass timber, or electrified buildings with high efficiency electric heat pumps for heating and cooling. We're thinking about housing that has physical and design and also programming that supports social connection between the residents. And this is for helping with emergency preparedness and also with social resilience more generally. And we're also thinking about housing that supports transportation options so that people are not stuck relying on cars to get around, and that there's options for walking, rolling, or using other forms of transit. And the potential benefits for all of this are really huge. So obviously we wanted to use this session to talk about what we've learned from BC Builds and how we can support these, how elements of this program can help support these aspirations and what might be applied to other contexts beyond BC Builds specifically. So a few days ago, BC Builds had shared in a newsletter, they already have 8 projects underway that are in construction, and there's another 16 that are in pre-development phase. So that brings the grand total number of units that they're saying right now is 2,861 homes for middle income households, and more in the pipeline. And this is, just over a year of the program being launched. So the question that we're asking and that we wanted to bring for discussion today is what we can learn and apply to our own communities. So I will turn it over to Amal. She's just spent months behind the scenes, joining different meetings of project development groups that are doing some of these units that I just talked about. She's learned a lot about the ins and outs of the program and has put together a really thoughtful analysis about what we can learn from all that they've been doing. So Amal, I will pass it over to you.
Thanks, Leanne. Hi, everyone. Thanks for joining today. So I will be presenting on the BC Builds program case studies and some key learnings and takeaways for housing context more broadly. BC Builds launched just over a year ago, and Leanne mentioned the numbers. They're really getting things done. A number of projects in pre-development or in construction or are getting there and in very little time. And so it's been an important program for us and for many others to learn from. I'll give you an overview of what I'll be speaking about. I'll first share why we became interested in BC Builds and wrote a case study about the program model. I'll give you an overview of what BC Builds as a program is and how it operates. Then I'll go into learnings from the program that can be impactful for addressing housing needs in a broader context. Specifically, I'll be speaking about how BC Builds is centering relationship building and partnerships, how they're addressing reconciliation, and the role of local government champions in this work. I'll say before I start that we are not BC Builds, and so we won't be speaking on their behalf or about their program as it is currently. I'll be speaking more about the case study that we put together. So, in February 2024, the provincial government launched a program called BC Builds. The goal of this program was to work with community landowners, so groups like local governments, faith communities, First Nation groups, and others, to allow them to build housing on their land. Now, at the time, we were in touch with Lisa Helps at BC Builds and her team because we, at the time, were interviewing nonprofit and public landowners who were actually doing this work, who were building housing on their land while not having any experience or expertise. And this is because one area of interest that we have is underutilized land, especially land owned by the community. So local governments, First Nations, nonprofit lands, etc. So we were speaking to churches, we spoke to local government and some other groups to find out about their process and the challenges they faced in building housing. And we actually later compiled these learnings into a series of case studies that you can read about it on our website. And Leanne will actually just pop the link to the case studies in the chat. So when BC Builds was first mandated, we found that not only was the program aiming to create more housing that aligned with these values and objectives, but the program model was also addressing some of the challenges that we had just heard about, that these community groups that we had interviewed had faced when building housing on their own lands. And at the time, there was also a lot of interest and some funding as well for jurisdictions across the country to replicate pieces of the BC Builds program in their own contexts. So we did a deep dive into the program and wrote a case study. You see the table of contents on the slide. The intended audience for the case study is local, regional, First Nations, and provincial governments to understand how to replicate or adapt the program to their own context. And it also highlights some key learnings from BC Builds that can be generalized to housing program context broadly. So you see in the table of contents, we've covered what the program is, we go into quite a bit of detail, how the province laid the program foundations, and with that, we have suggestions for replication, and then some key characteristics about the program that make it different from other BC housing programs. Um, I'll talk briefly about what the BC Builds program is for some context. So, BC Build is a rental housing supply program. Their mandate is to deliver middle income workforce housing on public, First Nations, community, and nonprofit land. The housing built under the program is intended for middle income renters, and this is different from other typical BC housing programs that aim to create usually supportive or affordable housing. And that's usually their focus. This one is for middle income renters. Another distinction is that BC Builds specifically aims to leverage underutilized lands owned by community landowners. And so this might be, for example, different government offices such as the Ministry of Health. It could be a municipality who has some extra land, a nonprofit, a First Nations group, a faith group, etc. So what BC Builds does is that they work with these community landowners to build on their underutilized land that would otherwise not be used for housing. So for example, if you think of a church with a really large parking lot that's underused for most of the week, they might be considering building housing on that parking lot, and BC Builds might be the right partner for them to do that. When BC Builds projects come into the portfolio, the goal of the program is to streamline the process and get projects from concept to construction in 12 to 18 months. And if you're familiar with development, for those of you who are, you know that this is much faster than the typical development timeline. How they do this is what they call their rocket ship model that allows them to work collaboratively and in partnership with the landowner, the developer, the municipality to streamline the development process, speed up the timeline, and also therefore save on costs. Another piece is that BC Builds also offers grants and low interest repayable loans to projects that come into their portfolio. And in return, the landowner is expected to bring equity in some form, and usually it's in the form of their land. So, I provided a high-level overview of what the program is, and you can learn about it in detail on their website or by reading the case study. But there are three pieces in the BC Builds model that are particularly interesting for us to learn from and may be useful to apply to your housing work in your communities. So I'll be speaking about how BC Builds is centering relationships and relationship building, advancing reconciliation, and the importance of project champions. The first learning I'll be speaking about from BC Builds is their emphasis on relationship building as part and parcel of the process. And this especially plays out in how they have their regular meetings with project groups. They call these meetings their project acceleration meetings because they accelerate the project. And the way this works is that BC Builds sets up regular and consistent meetings with the landowner in the program and then brings in other groups into the meeting that the landowner needs for the project to be successful. And then these meetings happen all along the development process at a frequency that's useful. So it can be biweekly or monthly or whatever is useful. BC Build's primary relationship then is with the landowner, whether that's government, First Nations, nonprofit community, whoever the landowner is, and other partnerships are brought in to address the landowner's development needs on a per project basis. So, for example, you see some groups on the screen, and depending on the project, any combination of these partners might be in a project meeting. So, for example, if the landowner representative is there, that might mean a church superintendent or a senior executive at a health authority. If there's federal funding involved, someone from CMHC might be there, or the First Nations Bank of Canada. You might also see representatives of the municipality that will be approving the project. What this model allows is for the landowner to have these regular check-ins and problem solve issues as they come up along the project. So as I was getting ready to write the case study, I was able to drop in on some of these project meetings because Lisa told me if you want to see how BC Builds works, you have to see it in action. And to see it in action, you have to come into these meetings. So I was able to do that over last summer. And so, for example, in one project meeting that I was part of, I was observing that the group was speaking about a privately owned land parcel that was intersecting their site that they were going to build on. And so at that meeting, BC Build staff were there, the landowner was there, the municipality was there. And in that meeting, the group was talking through together about their different options. So they were exploring, for example, what would it be like to expropriate the site, and what are the limitations of that? And how does it work if we, for example, design around the site for future use? So in that scenario, all the different representatives were adding their expertise and opinion. And as they were discussing, they were able to consider all the limitations and the advantages of all the different options. In another meeting, an architect was presenting some different designs of the proposed building. And in that meeting, each person was bringing what they needed. The municipality was there, the landowner was there, BC Build staff were there, some other professionals were there. And they were asking questions like, well, for example, what happens if we put the communal kitchen in this space so that all the different users of the building can access it? How will that change costs? And what would happen if we move these parking spots from this location to this other location and put this other piece over here? And just having conversations like these and problem solving together. And if you're familiar with development, you know that this saves so much time. And because it saves time to have these regular check-ins and problem solve together with all the different partners, it also saves money in a project. In each of the meetings I was in, I was asking folks, what makes this meeting space useful for you? And you can see some of the ways that it's made a difference for them on the slides. I have some quotes here, and there are many more quotes in the case study that you can look at. But primarily, I was hearing that the meeting space was creating trust between project partners who, in a typical project, may not often see eye to eye or understand each other's perspectives or meet that often. And this proactive, regular coordination also is helping reduce delays and improve alignment because project partners then had the chance to provide timely feedback and anticipate challenges as they came up. The next learning I'll be speaking about is advancing reconciliation. So while BC Build is not an official action of the provincial government to implement the Truth and Reconciliation Commission's calls to action, in the program development and in its implementation, BC Builds emphasizes relationship building with First Nations and First Nations economic development corporations. And the way they do this is that First Nations economic development corporations, which are actually for-profit entities, are eligible for their grants. And this is usually atypical because for-profit corporations are typically not eligible for grants under a program administered by a provincial entity. And I'll give you an example that we also write about in the case study about how BC Builds essentially went the extra mile to include a First Nations group in their portfolio. So there was a nation that was building 20 homes in 5 separate buildings on reserve land, but they were short about $1.77 million on their project. They had already contributed their own equity, they had secured federal match funding, and their per unit costs were well within the BC Builds threshold. But because they were trying to build on reserve land, they had some challenges. So, for example, existing government policies don't easily allow nations to secure financing from traditional channels on reserve land without a land code. And to obtain some of that traditional financing, the nation may have needed to take a 12 to 18-month process involving their entire membership and the federal government. And so the nation wanted to participate in the BC Builds program. They had their equity, they had match funding, their project was well within the BC Builds limits, but they just weren't able to access their funding because of these policies that were holding them back. And so to address this, BC Build was essentially able to work with them to create another option, another structure that would help them avoid any delays. And so the learning here is that reconciliation isn't just a symbolic gesture, it's also practical efforts to co-create solutions with First Nations partners and Indigenous partners, especially when we're up against complex barriers. And we know that housing can be a vehicle for reconciliation. And BC Builds is doing this not only by delivering homes for First Nations groups, but also by building capacity and supporting economic development. The last learning that I'll speak about today is the importance of project champions in supporting this kind of housing, especially housing that converges climate and affordability. So at the 1 year anniversary of BC Builds, when we also launched this case study, this was back in February, we held a workshop where we invited 3 municipalities participating in BC Builds to share about how their projects were helping them to advance housing priorities in other work in their municipalities that weren't BC Builds projects. So at the workshop, a planner from Penticton shared about their BC Builds project. And also I'll share some learnings from that. So in Penticton, they were able to identify and already pre-zone some city sites that were in a prime location and could be developed through the program. But for them, finding champions was key for them in the process. To make the project successful, they needed to find people to buy into the vision and sell the message to others about how the project could benefit the city and bring much needed support for workforce housing. So city staff in that context were able to approach council, show them how this project, this BC Builds project would be well aligned with what's needed for their residents. And so they were able to do that in collaboration with council. Another example that I'll share is a recent BC Builds project that was approved in the city of Langley, and they just went through a very contentious public hearing. This happened in April, I believe. There was quite a lot of backlash at the meeting. It lasted nearly 6 hours, and there were tens of people there to essentially complain about the size of the project and potential traffic. But despite all this, council actually ended up approving this BC Builds project. And so I can't speak for the city of Langley or for their council, but my observation is that because firstly, they were part of those regular and consistent check-ins leading up to the public hearing, they already had a lot of confidence and trust in the project despite public opposition. And they also knew that they needed to be champions and supporters of projects like these because one of their counselors said, and I'll quote her because I think it was so important. She said, "We all agreed on the onset of this term that one of our goals was to introduce and support housing options not available in Langley City currently. And one of the ones we identified at the onset was below market housing. In my opinion, this is what we were elected to do." So being a project champion was really important in that work. And a last example I'll share is about Moyta in New Westminster, and some of you may be familiar with this one. This isn't a BC Builds project, but it's another example of councillor and mayor commitment to both building excellent and affordable housing, as well as reconciliation in their communities. This project is now providing affordable housing for Black and Indigenous people and families in New Westminster. This project also faced community opposition, but existing City of New Westminster policies and city staff and advocates resolve the barriers, leading to City Council unanimously approving the project. Now, coming back to what we talked about earlier, strong partnerships between the developers, the Swahili community, and the municipality made this project possible. And so the takeaway is project champions are so important to push these projects to the finish line. And as electeds who have a commitment to climate, you have an opportunity to step into that role. And that's all I had to share. The case study is available on our website. We also have an online workshop coming up next week on Tuesday. This is for city staff. And so if you want to pass the invitation along to staff in your communities, we'd be happy to have them there. And follow along on our value-added housing project, the project that this case study was under, and our other projects by following us on LinkedIn or subscribing to our mailing list. And thanks for listening.
All right. Thanks, Mel. That was great, and Leanne also for your introduction. So maybe at this point we'll stop the recording.